So what I want to start talking about today is last week was terrible for me. So who here is a founder of a business in particular? Mostly everybody, correct? Okay. So we all have terrible weeks, but this week in particular was really, really bad for me. My Sunday night started off, there we go. My Sunday night started off arguing with this woman. So this is my partner in crime, Jennifer. We had the classic kind of recurring argument that I'm sure a lot of you guys have with your significant others about time and basically being involved with a business. And that person comes to you and asks for a very reasonable request of like, hey, can I get more of your time? And then you go, I don't have any time. Can I give you something else? And they say no most of the time. Then unfortunately on Monday, I found out that, ooh, this is going to be tough, guys. I found out that in a routine doctor appointment that I have a tumor. And it's not necessarily cancerous, just to be super clear. The doctor is really, really basically very, very positive about what's going on. But to give you a little bit of context, if you don't know me that well, I'm a 2-time cancer survivor at this particular point. And so a third bout with cancer feels a little bit terrifying, if that makes sense. And then basically on Tuesday, what ended up happening is we've been changing our content game, and unfortunately, I've been kind of a linchpin in a lot of the way that we're changing up the way we're doing content. AKA, I've been a huge blocker by not getting stuff ready for the team, so I've been blocking my team in a lot of different ways. And we were doing a really, really big sprint, and so I had these two things starting my week off with, and then by Tuesday, Wednesday, my team was basically like, hey, we're trying to get this going before you leave for a week. We really, really need to get this stuff out the door. And so I was like, the classic crap, I need to work harder, I need to do more. And then what ended up happening is there was an event last week, Thursday, in New York that I committed to going to. And it was one of those things where it was like a classic, I should just say no, I should just drop out, but I had canceled on someone already. And so my Midwest guilt from growing up in rural America was like, no, this is your word, go take care of it. So I was on a 4-hour train down to New York, went to the event, constantly was like, I should be working, so didn't get a lot out of the event. And then on my 4-hour train ride home, around 11:30 at night, we had a particular popular individual in the world of tech basically tweet that I was a spiteful human because I was doing competitive ads, or ProfitWell was doing competitive ads. And there's a whole philosophical debate whether that's right or wrong or that's morally correct or whatever. But what was really hurtful or was really tough was that basically a bunch of people were piling in and was like, yeah, Patrick's low class, a bunch of other fun stuff. And so it's one of these situations where I'm sitting there and I'm like, shit, it's a tough week and now this is happening. And so I responded, I didn't feed the troll essentially, and I responded and then it just kind of went out of control and I just shut my laptop at 11:30. And then finally, to top it all off, I get back and my team's like, hey, you're leaving Saturday night. That's when I left for a trip to Amsterdam because I was in Riga working with some companies the first half of this week. And basically, my entire Friday was booked with interviews because we're hiring rapidly right now. And then I had to work basically all night Friday and then come in and film a bunch of stuff for our content Saturday before I left, which then kind of started the cycle again because Jenny was then pissed off. She was very, very great, but it was one of those things where she was like, hey, we just talked about this, and literally I haven't seen you since that conversation, essentially. And this other major health thing came up, and so it was a tough week, right? And for those of you in here who are execs or founders, we all have these weeks, right? So who here in this room, it's not a contest, but who's had these types of weeks before? Terrible weeks, yeah? Be honest with yourselves. Everyone here has had terrible, terrible weeks. And what was interesting about this in particular is that I typically approach these types of weeks, especially if you've read my content or our content, you know me about a little bit, very methodically, very calculating, very professorial, very kind of focused on the numbers and things like that. But what was really interesting is because this week was so emotional, I could have had a breakdown, but thankfully I had a little bit of a breakthrough. And what was fascinating is I basically kind of crystallized around this is why all of the luminaries of Silicon Valley and all the luminaries of business really talk about this whole concept of focusing on your customer. Because while this was all going on, we had one of our best weeks from an MRR perspective in terms of growth on one of our products. We had an amazing, basically someone who had churned a while ago that was a big company basically come back. We had a number of people basically write in and were like, oh my God, this new feature is amazing, et cetera. And for me, from a philosophical standpoint, I had never really realized how important focusing on your customer and how important that particular person or persons is to your business from an emotional and kind of that philosophical perspective. Now, I've talked a lot about from a data perspective how important this is, and we're definitely going to talk about that. But what really started to get me was that a lot of us in our businesses right now, we all understand this concept. We've all retweeted articles that talk about focusing on our customer. We've all talked about, basically giving advice to other people about talking to our customer. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, we aren't really doing this. And we have some data that supports that. But if we're really being introspective within our businesses, if we're really understanding what's going on with our businesses, and we're really honest with ourselves, a lot of us will realize that when we have weeks like the one that I had and all of you have had as well, most of the time we're getting distracted by those distractions, not focusing on our customers, and then chasing things in other directions. And a little bit more practically, when we really look at where we're spending most of our time within our businesses, most of the time it isn't really focused on where that customer is. And so, long story short here, this is why I want to focus our time a little bit and talk a little bit about why it's so important to focus on our customers. And in addition to that, go through some data, go through some insights that really kind of break down exactly why this is so important for different areas of your growth. Make sense? Does this sound fun? Exciting? If you're not excited, I'm not excited, just to be super clear. Cool? Okay. So why is this so crucial? So it really comes down to a couple of factors, but when you think about your business, and it doesn't matter if you're a subscription company, if you're a SaaS company, if you're a retail company, if you're selling, whatever, everything that you do in your business is basically driving towards that particular customer. So from a philosophical standpoint, your sales, your marketing, your product, your finance, that entire function within your organization is used to either drive a particular customer to a conversion point or to justify a product or a price that you're offering. That's why your customers are so important. But what's really, really fascinating is that 5, 10 years ago, if you were building a business, you didn't necessarily have to focus on your customer as much. You could basically engineer your way from a growth perspective to basically acquiring as many customers as possible, because what ended up happening is there just wasn't as much competition in the market because there just wasn't as much software in the market. Now today, we have situations like this, where essentially you have these MarTech landscape graphs, where this is the 7,000 or so companies that are basically entirely focused on helping you grow your business. So most of us in this room are probably on this graph somewhere if you want to spend the time actually trying to find your logo. But what's really fascinating about this is that this graph, or this marketing landscape, this only had about 400 companies on it 5 years ago. And this explosion of basically the ability to basically spin up servers, spin up a landing page, spin up a billing system, has actually caused massive competition to happen in the market. And as a result, what's going on here is that we've lost a lot of our power as businesses. So to give you some context, 5, 10 years ago, if you were going to start a business, you had to have some sort of technical aptitude or money to basically acquire the technical aptitude, where today, a lot of that AWS debt is basically taken off your plate. And in addition to that, it's just easier and easier to build software today than it was 5 to 10 years ago. It's not easy to grow a business, but unfortunately, what's happened because of all of this easiness in terms of building software is that we've lost a lot of this power. And we see this when we look at things like CAC, or customer acquisition costs. So blended CAC has actually increased by about 60 to 70% over the past 5 years. What that means for you who are not maybe as up on unit economics is that customer that might have cost you $100 5 years ago is now costing you $155 to $170 today. And this is in both B2B and B2C. And when we cut this by Arpu, when we cut this by LTV, all across the board, this remains the exact same. Now, what's fascinating about this is that in addition to that, because there's so many features, because there's so much competition out there, the relative value of features has declined. So if you were building a software product 5, 10 years ago and you had a Salesforce integration, that Salesforce integration you might have been able to charge $1,000 a month in addition to your core product for. That same integration today is now basically worth about 1/3 of what it was 5 years ago. And this is just because there's so much software out there, right? You have Zapier, you have all these different things for integrations in particular, but also like we're no longer as beautiful snowflakes as we thought we were, mainly because like there's a lot of competition for mainly the products that we're building, if not indirect competition for the value that we're trying to provide. Does that make sense? So what's interesting is that everything's amazing, and our customers are still pissed. So it's probably really difficult for anyone to stand up and say that software is not objectively better today than it was 5 years ago. But when we look at blended NPS scores, and this is across B2B, B2C, tons of different sizes, and these are the actual scores. This isn't some survey data. These are actual scores. What we find is that 5 years ago, the average NPS blended across a bunch of different businesses was about 34. NPS today, blended across the same businesses, is now about 10. And this isn't happening because, again, we're worse at our jobs. It's just happening because our consumers have different expectations now. Essentially, that really cool feature that you thought was amazing 5 years ago is now basically the bread and water of software, and it's just expected. And so you have this situation where there's so much more competition, CAC is increasing steadily, willingness to pay is dropping overall, and then all of a sudden your consumers or your customers are still unhappy. And what's scary about that in particular is that the reason that focusing on your customer is so important really just comes down to market dynamics. Because at the end of the day, you can't control these things that are happening in the market. There are plenty of things that you can control in your business, and you can look at this data and go, well, you know, we can be better, we're gonna have really good growth hacking, hey, we're really gonna have good feature development. But at the end of the day, the market is the market, and the market doesn't really care about how you're gonna move. It's gonna continue moving forward based on these trends that we're seeing. Now, what's kind of fascinating about this is that in particular, you know, we can overcome this basically by following the fundamentals that those luminaries of Silicon Valley talk to us about. And this is essentially what I want to follow through on the rest of the presentation today, is talking about how you can know your customer and how you can do that on a quantitative basis and how that affects your pricing, your product, your marketing, all types of different things within your business. And in particular, what I want to talk about really briefly first is that some of you in the room might be going, hey, customer research, I heard about that 15 years ago. Thanks, Grandpa, right? Like, that's something that's cool, right? Like, I've heard about that. But what's really fascinating is when we talk to founders and we talk to executives and we ask them how many non-sales research conversations they're having with their customers or target customers per month, most of us, 7 out of 10 of us, are having 10 or less of those conversations per month. That's not a lot. And there's Fortune 500 companies that are in this particular data set. Now, what's interesting is that, especially at a little bit more dev-focused conferences, I think there's a little bit more of a dev crowd here, I get a lot of responses of like, well, I don't talk to my customers, but I do a lot of testing. I do a lot of A/B testing, multivariate testing. Nope. Just under half of us are doing 0 tests per month. And this includes marketing experiments, right? So again, we love to retweet the articles. We love to give the advice. But in actuality, most of us aren't actually doing our jobs when it comes to growing a business and actually understanding that customer and then the functions that come from that in our product, our pricing, et cetera. And so how do we overcome this? Well, what I want to walk through is basically using real data, particularly our data on how we built out ProfitWell, in order to give you some case study information as well as some good frameworks to actually understand this. We're going to go a little bit quicker now and actually walking through these different pieces. I'd encourage you to focus on the framework. We're going to have plenty of time for questions. We're going to share the slides. We're going to share the data. But focus on the framework in particular because it's going to change a little bit depending on your business. And so what we're going to walk through is not only how this customer research can help your product and your pricing and your marketing, but also how it can validate essentially what you're building for the customer subset that you're focused on. And what we'll end up doing is we'll talk a little bit about ProfitWell and Price Intelligently. So for those of you who don't know, basically Price Intelligently and ProfitWell, you may have heard of one or both of those brands in particular, but we started the company about 6 years ago. focused just on pricing software. So we were building pricing software, then it morphed into a tech-enabled service, and we were basically helping really, really big software and SaaS brands get their pricing right using a bunch of data. Over time, we actually had a situation where we basically were helping a particular company that was about to IPO with their pricing, and they were basically calculating MRR completely incorrectly. And that was kind of the birth of the idea for ProfitWell, because a CFO who had taken 2 other companies public was taking his 3rd company public and was getting this basic metric wrong. It was one of those things where we thought, we can help that particular problem. And so at this point, we launched ProfitWell about 4 or so years ago. And at this point in time, we actually have seen inside more subscription companies than anyone else out there. Depending on how you measure it, we have about 25 to 30% of the entire subscription market using ProfitWell right now. And it's given us a lot of insight into what works and what doesn't. And in particular, when we were launching ProfitWell, what was really kind of fascinating is that we are a bootstrapped company, and so we launched it as a separate brand, as a separate endeavor. And what ended up happening is when we were ready to actually put this out there and launch it beyond our beta customers, what was really, really fascinating is that as soon as we went out to market, we saw this. So 3 weeks before we launched ProfitWell officially to the market, Baremetrics had launched. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Baremetrics in some capacity or seen their content. 3 weeks after we launched, ChartMogul officially launched. I believe their beta, if not their full product. We've all probably heard of ChartMogul being in Europe as well. And then what's really fascinating is our larger customers were like, oh, this is like Domo or Insight Squared or Looker or a bunch of other really, really heavy BI products. And so this was a moment where we were like, this is the idea. This is where we're going to win. And then all of a sudden it was like, shit. Cancel all hopes and dreams, right? Because it was like we thought we had this market. We thought we were really, really clever. And then it's like, oh, yeah, like other clever people exist as well. And so what ended up happening is we started looking at kind of the core aspects of growth. And in my opinion, at least in what I've studied, growth really comes down to a lot of different things. But the 4 main things, in my opinion, that growth come down to are your product, your positioning, your market viability, and then value-based pricing. And so we're going to go through these 4 pillars, in particular of how we validated ProfitWell. In addition to that, we're going to go through some data to kind of show you how this data lives within our organization. So first up, product and feature viability. The first question that we had was basically, should we continue building this product? Because what was really fascinating is that after we had launched, there were about 36 other metrics for Stripe companies that had come out in addition to Baremetrics and ChartMogul. And so all of a sudden, you just have this massive market that was brewing on a very, very small market, actually, because there's not that many Stripe subscription companies that exist. Don't get me wrong, there's thousands of them, but it's not like we're talking about a market with millions of potential customers. And so what we ended up doing is we basically stopped building, we stopped buying ads, we stopped trying to acquire customers or users of that particular case, and we started focusing on what's going on with the customers that we want to target. And this is kind of the first practical piece here, is that when you're trying to figure out if your features or your product or the buyer that you're going after is really marketable, I want you to start with a draft of your buyer personas. And what these typically look like is something like this. So again, Grandpa HubSpot, Grandma Marketo have been talking about buyer personas for the better part of a decade. But what's fascinating about why they're talking about it is that these are extremely useful inside your organization to start to center your thinking. So for us, we knew there were about 2 buyers that we were actually going to go after. One was a startup, which essentially we thought was going to care about price, the depth of the metrics. We thought their lifetime value was going to be about $4,500. That was insane, as you'll see in a second. Willingness to pay, we thought the blended Arpu would be around $250, and then the CAC we thought was going to be pretty decent. And then a little bit of higher individual, which was going to be a little bit higher LTV, higher CAC, but ultimately a larger customer. And just by doing this, it started to center our conversation around, is this a viable particular product? Is this something that we should focus on? Or is it something that we should scrap and focus on something else? And what's kind of fascinating about this is that we then went out to validate this with data. And this is where a lot of customer development, if you are doing customer development, starts to stop. Where essentially you might put together those buyer personas. You might have 3 support tickets you look at that support your view, and then there's another 3 support tickets that support the other person's view, and then you argue and guess and check your way to a decision. And what's interesting is that a lot of these decisions can be very, very much solved or at least supported in one way or another with data. And a lot of us just don't have the tools to basically collect the right data. And so the tools that we recommend to validate, or the process that we recommend, is basically a variation of the scientific method. Who here has heard of the scientific method? Everyone? You learned that in elementary school, right? Hypothesis, test, all that kind of fun stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to go out. We have a question. Hey, is this viable? Who are we going to sell this to? We're going to collect some data in a scheduled manner from some people. We're going to run that data through some basic statistical models. That's going to quantify our buyer personas, and it's going to tell us viability. So the way that we did that is we used two different tools here. And these are two tools that we've talked about a lot. They don't require any money for you to go and get. They don't require that heavy of math skills, basic math skills, to actually use both of these. You can make them much more complicated and get much more complicated math into these. But if you're just starting out, don't worry about that right now. One is the relative preference analysis. This is essentially figuring out of a set of features, what is most valued and least valued. And then another is price sensitivity, which is ironically the easiest data for you to collect. On the relative preference side, the way that we're going to collect this data is through surveys. And who here likes surveys? Anyone? One of you. It's my best friend now. Two of you, my second best. Oh, I have more friends than most of the time at conferences. That's awesome. We hate surveys because we are terrible at sending surveys, full stop. Most of the time what ends up happening in the last survey that I grabbed, or that I saw, and I've said this at basically 10 different conferences, and it's always true because it's really true about the last survey I received. It was emailed to me. It was 40 questions long, and the first question is, what's your email address? Right? It's not respecting my time. It's not respecting your user's time, right? And there's just brilliant survey tools out there that let you not have to do that, so why wouldn't you use them? In actuality, surveys are a really, really powerful research tool. You just have to know how to ask the questions and how to respect your user's time. A couple of fun facts. Every survey that you send that is not compensated, it should be less than 60 seconds long. If it's less than 60 seconds long and not compensated, you can send that same person another survey probably around every 4 weeks. It's something where you can actually get really, really good research cycles out of free users, or free acquisition of these respondents. If it is a compensated survey, you can get about 15 minutes out of someone's time. And if you don't have people to survey, there are entire organizations where their entire goal is to sell you access to someone to answer a survey. This is how we did this because we didn't have access to enough people to actually survey in the early days for this particular product. But it was one of those things where essentially we were able to eliminate the bias, or reduce the bias. You're never going to eliminate bias completely, but reduce the bias with how we ask the questions, segmenting the data responses, and then ultimately getting the questions in a really, really timely manner. And the two tools that we use, as I already kind of introed, the first was this relative preference analysis. And this is basically figuring out who or how are you going to basically determine what features are most and least important. And the way that you're going to ask these particular questions is by using something like this. It's very subtle, but it's very powerful. What we're doing is we're showing someone 5 features or 5 value propositions or 5 design choices or 5 of something. And then we're asking what's the most important and what's the least important out of that particular list. And what's really powerful is with some basic math, you get output that looks like this. So what you're looking at here is essentially, by MRR, the answers to this particular question. And what's really powerful is I not only get rank order, but I also get magnitude. And the reason that's really, really important is that we get into our minds that we're building the next big thing. And sometimes when we put that out there, even with 4 other things that we think are the next big thing, no one cares about any of them, right? And all of that data would then be basically towards 0, towards the center of this particular graph. Now what's kind of cool, though, for the folks on this side of the room, but I'll try to make it clear for that side of the room, is that you'll notice that as a company gets bigger, they start to care more and more about accuracy. And as a company gets smaller, they care more and more about profitable being free, which is never something you want to see. It's terrible. But what's kind of cool is that when you make some assumptions about your personas, all of a sudden we can start to figure out, OK, this mid-enterprise Meredith person, who we're basically pegging at anyone making more than $1 million, which is definitely not true mid-enterprise, but it was our definition at the time. They really, really care about actionable insights and accuracy. The startup folks, anyone making less than $1 million, they're kind of all over the map, which indicates there's a lot of fragmentation in that particular market. And just with this one question, all of a sudden we're able to basically centralize what do these people care about if we continue building this product. Make sense? Cool. On the pricing side, go back once. On the pricing side, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to use a similar methodology, but we're going to take advantage of how human beings think about value. So the way that we think about value is in a spectrum. And what I mean by that is if I go up to you and I ask you, how much is this projector worth? It's a really, really tough question to answer. In particular, because a lot of you probably haven't purchased a projector before. But the other issue is that it's hard to answer that point-blank type of question. And even if you are able to, as the receiver of that information, I don't know if that's an overestimate, if it's an underestimate. I don't know how to take that data in context. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to ask in ranged questions. So at what price is this way too expensive that you'd never consider purchasing it? At what point is it a really good deal? At what point is it getting expensive? And really, really important for Europe in particular, at what point is it too cheap that you question the quality of it? Now, these types of questions, psychologists and economists have studied for decades this concept. They're able to essentially answer as a respondent in a much easier manner because there's some anchoring effect that's happening, and it doesn't feel like I have to get it perfectly right because you're asking me point blank. And when you take this data and massage it, you get output that looks like this. So each of these particular lines corresponds to each of those questions. At what point is it way too expensive, being all the way on the right? At what point is it way too cheap, all the way on the left? And down below there, you have what's called an elasticity curve. Anyone remember what that is? From high school, college? No one's confident enough to say anything? OK. Basically, it's a measure of, if I change my price, what's going to be the relative gain or loss in my number of customers for that particular data set? And what's really powerful about this in particular is that essentially you can start to figure out, OK, I might be priced too low, and I can actually raise my price and not only increase my conversion rate, but also increase my actual Arpu. And the reason I said, hey, this last question is really important for Europe is that historically, looking at hundreds of different companies at this point, from a pricing perspective, Europe is typically unequivocally underpriced. I don't know if it's like a psychological phenomenon, like something terrible happened in all of your childhood, but what's essentially happening is you don't think your products are good enough in the aggregate, right? And what's happened is basically you're underpricing your product, and people are thinking, oh, it's not worth what it actually is. And so that's what this data is really powerful for, because again, it makes you dispassionately look at what that willingness to pay is. And for us, when you're looking at this particular data set, you can start to figure out decisions or sub-decisions around your pricing. And we'll talk about pricing a little bit more depth in a second. But all of a sudden, you can say, OK, I want to maximize profitability. I'm going to be at the higher end of this particular curve. I want to maximize adoption. I want to be at the lower end of this particular curve. And notice how you're maximizing adoption, not just by lowering the price to 0, which is a lot of our concepts of what software is. And in reality, software acts a little bit more like a Louis Vuitton purse or something like that. Whereas the price increases, sometimes the actual demand increases because people put value in software, unlike they put value in commodities or other goods. And for us in particular, what we found is that on the low end, essentially that startup Steve was willing to pay about $50 a month. And on the high end, that individual was willing to pay about $150 to $200 per month. Now, do you remember kind of the first draft, the hypothesis that we had, right? Well, we did a little bit extra data, and we basically discovered that we were woefully off. And the model that we used to calculate or estimate LTV as well as estimate customer acquisition cost, it was a little bit more complicated than what I'm showing you. But essentially, we looked at ranges. And what we found was terribleness. We basically found that on the low end, we were essentially going to break even. And then on the higher end, our high end, we essentially were going to basically be completely underwater, right? And what's kind of interesting about this in particular is that any BI or analytics products in the room? OK, cool. I can talk shit about BI. Great. No, this is what BI faces constantly. This is why it's so hard to build a business intelligence or analytics product, is because most customers, and we're not even looking at like retention really here, most customers don't appreciate how much work or effort goes into building the product. And ultimately, what ends up happening is even though you're doing a monstrous amount of work for them, they still don't appreciate it. And that sucks, but that's the reality of what we saw. And as a side note, we've seen this in a number of different BI products that we've worked with on the Price Intelligently side. But this is kind of fascinating, because this is why most BI products end up going up market, essentially. We've all seen like BI products launch, and they say, we're going to democratize business intelligence. And then they end up going after Fortune 500 companies, right? Mixpanel, great example. okay? So this whole exercise of testing viability, this took us 12 hours. It cost us $2,100. Those are US dollars, so that's a little cheaper for you guys even further. And what's amazing about this in particular is that in hindsight, we estimate that this put us about 18 months ahead. And what I mean by that is both of our competitors, our main competitors in this particular product, tried, and one didn't end up going with a free plan. The other did end up having a free plan. In addition to that, at the time, our Arpu and basically our LTV numbers were basically spot on with one of our competitors who publishes their financial data. They've now gotten better, which is great. But it's one of those things where we basically were able to make a decision earlier and see this data earlier than anyone else by putting in 12 hours and $2,100 worth of work. And the only reason we spent that $2,100 was because we needed to get, I think it was like 350 responses to these surveys in order to basically fuel the data. Make sense? This is something you can do really, really quickly within your organization. And I'd encourage you not necessarily do it for your core product. I mean, obviously, if you're thinking of a new core product, it's really useful. But you should be using this for features and functionality as well. If you've ever worked in a larger organization, there's always the classic, like, oh, let's go down market, let's go up market. And then there's no studying of what's actually happening at those parts of the market. This type of methodology you can use really, really usefully to basically test the viability of where you're supposed to be going. Now, along that front, we'll skip that, yeah. When we talk about pricing in particular, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. How much time do you think people spend on their pricing per year? I'm actually asking. An hour per year, nice. You kind of know where I'm going with this, so I like the lowball answer, that's great. Anyone else? Anyone like really bullish? No? 2 hours. 2 hours? I like that. It's like the Price is Right, right? So in actuality, they spend about 15 hours in the entire history of their business. And what's really interesting about this is that as a company gets longer in the tooth or older, this number doesn't really change. It does go up a little bit, but it doesn't go up that dramatically, which is kind of scary if you really think about it. And what's kind of fascinating is that when you isolate the impact of pricing, or excuse me, if you isolate the impact of acquisition, monetization, and retention on your business, what's really interesting is if you improve your acquisition by about 1%, meaning you improve your net new leads, you improve your conversion rate, you're going to see about a 2% boost in your bottom line. And 4 years ago, that was 3%. So there's been a third drop, essentially, in that impact. And if you improve, essentially, your monetization, your Arpu by about 1%, or your retention by about 1%, you'll actually see drastically different results. And what's interesting about this, just to give you context, is that essentially what's happening in the world, based on all that stuff we talked about in the first part of the presentation, is that we're looking at just surviving by being good at growth. Like just surviving, we need to be good at acquisition. We can't survive if we're only focused on acquisition. But if we audit where most of our effort goes, it's probably going to basically trying to acquire more customers. Which again, you absolutely have to acquire customers to survive. But at the end of the day, your growth is probably going to be coming from looking at your pricing and focusing on your retention to basically get those bigger growth rates that you need in particular. And what's kind of interesting about this, it's kind of summarized there, is that when we looked at ProfitWell out of the gate, that 50 to kind of 250 range that we talked about, kind of in the buyer persona section, it was really telling also from a range perspective. So what you're looking at here is basically our lowest end customer willing to pay about $50, our highest end customer at the time willing to pay about $250. And the reason that that's problematic is because of something called net negative churn, which I'm sure we've all kind of heard about in a little bit context. But basically, the problem here is that there's only a 5x lift between our lowest end customer and our highest end customer. And what that means is that if I lose one of these higher end customers, I need a good number of people to upgrade. But how quickly do you think people grow from 100,000 MRR to 250,000 MRR to 500,000 MRR to higher? How quickly do you think they grow? Any idea? Anyone? Yeah, it takes a long time. It takes years, typically, for most businesses. Now, there are high-growth businesses, don't get me wrong, but for most businesses, they're not moving up that quickly. So when you only see a 5x kind of curve within these particular data that you're collecting, it's really, really problematic. And so fortunately, we had some foresight here, and we collected some data on what ended up being retained. And we basically collected data on like, hey, if I solve retention at this level for your size business, how much are you willing to pay for that solution? And those people who weren't willing to pay $50 a month for analytics were willing to pay $150 a month for retention solutions. And then all of a sudden, we have that nice lift to 4-figure MRR, which is all like really nice to see, obviously. And so kind of the TLDR here is when you're looking at your pricing in particular, the most important thing that I would argue for most people in this particular room, companies that are under 20 million, a good group of us under 10 million, the most important thing is to figure out what your value metric looks like. Now, your value metric is what you charge for. So in the previous slide, if you could go back one, in particular, if we're charging along an axis of basically the size of the company, it's really, really hard for that value metric to get enough velocity for us to get expansion revenue and net retention. But if we're charging based on something like the amount of churn that we actually solve for them, that's one of those things where that scales really, really nicely across different size companies. It actually allows us to get some really nice expansion revenue as well. And this gets to the crux of what value-based pricing is. So value-based pricing essentially is basically pricing based on the value that your customer sees and aligning with that value as close as humanly possible. And the reason it's superior to costs in your competitors is that your customers don't care about your costs, they care about their costs. In addition to that, your competitors, you're assuming they've done their homework, which all data indicates they haven't. And in addition to that, you're also assuming you're selling the same product to the same customer, which is probably not the case. And so these data points are important, don't get me wrong, but they're tertiary inputs into basically putting your pricing together. And if that's not convincing enough, what we found is that those companies that are deploying a value metric are typically growing at 2x the rate as those companies who are only using feature differentiation. And so if you take away one thing from this particular section, go home and figure out what your value metric should look like, because it bakes expansion revenue right into your revenue model, which is great. Keep going. And keep going. All right, so product. What's really fascinating about this in particular is that, unfortunately, because of what's happening in the market, a lot of us are building the wrong product. And I know that's a bold statement, particularly at 10:30 in the morning. But it's one of those things where what we found is that in most of the data that we're looking at, a lot of the features that we think are driving value aren't driving value. And to kind of introduce this, I have to introduce a new model that might actually be super helpful in your business, and it's a classic 2x2. Any MBAs in the room? No? This is like oh, there we go. This is like catnip, right? This is 2x2s. You guys love your 2x2s. No? Dad jokes? We can't do dad jokes in the morning? Come on. All right, anyways. Now what's really cool about this is that when you look at a particular product and look at this matrix, remember there's these two axes of value. There's the features in that particular product, and then there's the willingness to pay. So if we look at a cup of coffee, this x-axis is the relative value of the attributes, that max diff or that most and least important curve that we were looking at. And the max diff for these features are things like taste, country of origin, et cetera. The other axis of value, which we already talked about, was the actual willingness to pay for that cup of coffee. And that's a little bit more straightforward. Now what I can do is I can actually plot the particular answers to those questions along this particular matrix. So I can look at all of these particular features. I can poll this entire room, one of those most and least important questions, and I can basically determine most of you care about the taste of your cup of coffee. There's very few of you who care about temperature, and a lot of you don't care about the country of origin. Only the hipsters in the room probably care about country of origin, right? Now, when I cross-reference willingness to pay data against this, I get results that look like this. So those of you who really, really care about taste, you have higher willingness to pay than the rest of the room. Those of you who care about temperature, your willingness to pay is lower. And those who care about country of origin, your willingness to pay is also higher. And so within this matrix, if there's something that's really valuable from a feature perspective and there's willingness to pay for it, you have a differentiable feature. If there's something that has low value from a feature perspective but high willingness to pay, you have an add-on. High value, low willingness to pay, you have a core feature. And then my personal favorite, trash land, right? Now what's really, really kind of cool, or not so cool, I should say, is that we went out to about 1,300 product leaders and we asked them, for your last N features, where do they exist on this matrix? And what was kind of scary is that this is what they said. We're building a lot of valuable features, apparently. There's a couple of insecure folks amongst us who think they're building trash, right? And they're extremely confident in this data. This is 5,000 different features that they built. They're extremely confident that this is what they're building. The confidence scores are 90 to 100%, which is insane. Should never be that confident in anything most of the time. Now, we went out to about 1.2 million customers, and we used a more sophisticated upgrade of those two different methodologies that we talked through in the viability section. And we actually asked these 1.2 million customers what they actually thought of these features, and this is what we found. Right? Now, we laugh, but this is insane. The speed of the market has basically caused us to be really, really confident without any data, because we're not talking to our customers, we're not doing this testing, and all of a sudden we're building a lot of features that we think are valuable, we think are going to drive willingness to pay. In actuality, essentially we're building a lot of core features and a lot of trash. And it's not to say you don't have to, or you can't, or it's not to say you can get away with never building trash. Like, you're going to have to build some features that just because you have to, there's going to be some things that you're going to build in your product that aren't going to be great. But at the end of the day, we're not driving basically our expansion revenue, nor driving really value within our products based on our current framework of building product. And for ProfitWell in particular, this is what a value matrix looked like, where I'm not going to show you everything, because this thing is something one of our competitors really focuses on, and I don't want them to know. But subscription financial analytics, that was something that was basically core. Essentially, there wasn't a lot of willingness to pay. We saw that data previously. That retention solution, that's retain, there was high willingness to pay for that and a good slight value there. But then also what's interesting is things like revenue recognition, which is another product that we have, as well as things like full BI customization, which is basically like building a Periscope data or Looker. But all of a sudden, like just with some basic data and taking essentially the model that we showed before, we kind of know what's happening in our customers' heads, right? And this can actually guide what's happening with our product development. And when we cross-reference other feature sets and different things like that, we can basically make it a little bit more dispassionate about what we're building. Now, the classic response or the classic objection I get at this point is the Steve Jobs argument or the Henry Ford argument, right? Steve Jobs, hey, if the customer or the person who said the customer is always right was in fact a customer. Henry Ford, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? We've all heard those, yeah? Here's the problem with that logic. First, Apple spends in the top 50 in the world in market research every single year. Also, when you look at Ford, Ford got smoked after the Model T. GMC, which I don't know if you guys know a lot about American cars, but GM basically was like, oh, interesting. People do want more than a black car. They want colors. They want different features. They want different functionality. And if you look at basically the growth and revenue of GM versus Ford in the early days, GM was basically just passing them by, and it still stayed pretty much on top because of that focus basically on the customer. That being said, you can look at this data, and if you have other data, if you have other context, you absolutely can look at this data and say, the customer's wrong, I'm going to go build something else. That's OK, but you should collect this data before you do that so you know the risk that you're taking. And we've done that in a couple of different cases. We've basically built stuff where we were like, hey, this data says we shouldn't build this, but we feel that the market's going this way. We've batted about 50% on that. 50% of the time we were right, 50% of the time we were completely wrong. But we had this data to know, hey, are we fighting an uphill battle where we have to train people on why this is so cool? Or is it something where we know exactly what the customer's thinking? But long story short, I would say you need to move your product to a little bit less reactionary, a little bit less guess and check, and a lot more methodical about how you're building product. And this really starts with just having customer development conversations. So if you take away anything from this particular section, I would recommend putting a number on the board for you if you're a solo or a small team, or your actual product leader, to basically have 10 calls in that particular month in a non-sales capacity talking to customers. It's really, really fascinating the things you learn. And in particular, it's really, really powerful, especially if you start to make this more quantitative about how this can actually guide what you're building in a really, really efficient, high ROI manner. So finally, marketing. So this is really around positioning. Now, what's kind of fascinating is when we collected this data, and this was a little bit more recent than the early days, but when we collected data on our value propositions in the generalized market, what we found is that in the generalized market across all different segments, basically the most important thing was accuracy, right? We kind of saw that in the earlier data as well. We're not going to show you these two for the reasons I discussed previously. And then this whole concept of getting your metrics free was also something that wasn't really that powerful in the generalized market. Now, what was really kind of cool is what we did over time is because when you're going out and acquiring customers, depending on your space, you have two options or two pools for your customers. You have basically the generalized market, people who don't have a solution or who are not really enamored with a particular solution. And then you have people who are using your competitor products, right? Those are the two groups. So when we looked at the generalized market, we basically found this is what's happening. So this started driving a lot of our content, a lot of our product marketing, et cetera. But the next thing we did is we actually went out and we found our competitor customers. We asked them a survey where basically we measured what their NPS was for our competitors' products, and then we asked them a battery of these particular questions. Because we wanted to understand why they basically were liking these products and not using us, because we had a value prop of being free, we had a value prop of being accurate, et cetera. And this is what we found. So this is a blend of our different competitors, and this is essentially the folks who are not happy. So this is NPS essentially below 10. And so what we found is that the people who were unhappy with our competitors, they really cared about accuracy, they cared about this second thing, they did not care about free, and they did not care about that last feature in particular. And so this is what drove our decision in particular to go, okay, well, if these people are unhappy and they care about the thing that we have and that we feel is a competitive advantage, that's something where we can actually go out and we can do some funnels and some campaigns against our competitors' customers, which we've done, and they've been extremely successful from an ROI perspective. And what's kind of powerful about this is that there's a lot of kind of conceptions about don't worry about your competitors, don't worry about your competitors. And I think that's exactly good advice, but depending on your space, and we're not in an extremely competitive space, we're not like in the e-commerce platform or the email marketing space, but in particular, the context is really, really important. It's just the level through which it's going to drive your decision-making is something that you need to really, really control. Because for us, it was one of these things where we knew that we had some competitive advantages, and so we wanted to target those people who were unhappy with these two particular features that are at the top, and we basically could use that as our competitive advantage. Now, what's also interesting is collecting this type of data. What you can actually do is start to collect this by channel as well. So we started collecting, as someone came in, a similar kind of survey. It didn't include NPS, but basically asked them, okay, what was the value proposition that basically really, really drove you? And what you're seeing here is this red basically caring about that core. And then all of a sudden, this blue is kind of all over the place, right? They really, really care about free. And so that drove essentially our copy, not only in our ads, but also drove our copy for the content they were driving to. So instead of just going like, hey, we're accurate, which was our early, basically acquisition model and our acquisition messaging, we were able to start tailoring to these different particular channels the different message that we're going after. Now, for those of the growth marketers in the room, you're like, yeah, of course, this is what you should do, right? But the problem is that the way that you get here more often than not is through guess and check iterative testing, right? Hey, let's put $1,000 out with this message. Let's put $1,000 out with this message. Let's see which one wins, and let's see how we can figure this out. The problem is, again, having a little bootstrapper brain, we were like, how do we get better ROI out of this? And so we studied this in particular, and then that guided our tests to validate this particular data, which then allowed us to basically know within a certain level of confidence that this is exactly what we should be doing. And again, it was extremely powerful in terms of ROI, and it was one of those things where we basically turned it on, and within reason, it basically perfectly worked, which was really, really cool to see. So long story short, I think growth really requires the right inputs to properly acquire your customers in particular, mainly because that particular input is really going to guide your basically development of not guessing and checking and being a lot more methodical about how you approach your acquisition. And to kind of recap here, the big thing here, again, as businesses, we've lost a lot of our power. It's not in our control because that's just what's happening in the market, and it's great, right? The gold rush of SaaS is maybe not completely over, but it's mostly over, right? We're heading into a more mature market, but that means we need to change. And in particular, we have to understand our customers on a much deeper level to take advantage of these constraints in a way that actually makes us successful. And so overall, just to kind of recap here, this is the growth model that we think about. I would collect data on one of these axes if you haven't collected data ever. Typically, I recommend starting with pricing because most of you are probably underpriced in some capacity, and so it's something that's really, really easy to kind of get out of the gate. Typically, it's a nice quick win and gets your confidence up. But it's something that when you look at these particular levels of growth, it's one of those things that's really, really helpful to have data to basically guide all of these different pieces. And what's kind of interesting, we have one person, 20% dedicated to this for their job. This does not require a full-time person. You can have a full-time person if you want more and more data, depending on your stage. But this is not something that's extremely taxing. Yes, their first cycle is probably going to be not as much data as you'd want, but they're going to get better and better. And as this becomes part of your culture, it's really, really cool how it impacts every single part of the organization, essentially. And with that, I'll end on know thy customer. It's really, really important. And if you have any other questions, I'm pc@profitwell.com. As some of you know, I typically do get back to you. Sometimes it takes a little while, but I do get back to everyone in a certain amount of time. If you have questions on pricing, this kind of stuff, data, and other things. But I'd love to take some questions.
All right, I'll rush over with the mic if you're...
Yeah.
We're thinking, actually, if you, during the talk, often I'll find this during a talk, not for this one, obviously, because you'd have to go back in time to do this. But if you tweet during... Yeah, if you tweet during the talk, using the hashtag LTV Conf, CONF. We will collect those and then we'll do the Q&A from there. But for now, we'll do the hands up and I'll race around like an idiot thing. Cool? Cool.
Hi, Patrick.
How are you?
Okay. We're a retained customer at Meet Edgar, by the way. Just to give a shout out for that. It's free money, so pretty cool.
Love that.
I was wondering so in surveying your competitors' customers, which is something we haven't done, I can imagine how you could target them through Facebook or Twitter ads. What have you found as an effective incentive for getting them to actually fill out the survey?
So it's kind of interesting. That's a great question. So to be clear, I wouldn't, so competitor research, I would do some of the other stuff first. This is like a 201 level or 301 level research. Normally, unhappiness is a really great incentive. So if you put, if you put some sort of messaging or copy around ads of like, hey, like unhappy with your, like we didn't name them in some of those research ads because we wanted to kind of control some of the bias, but like, hey, unhappy with your analytics, like those types of copy really worked. But also it's a little bit of a small community, so we got a little clever with like in Hacker News and in a couple of different forums going, hey, I'm researching the BI space, here, could you take this survey, right? And the first question was basically like, hey, what are you using for this? And we included ourselves, right? So like Barometrics, ChartMogul, ProfitWell, and we named a couple of others that we were curious about. And then it was like NPS and a couple of the other stacked questions. And so this wasn't the highest end value for this type of data. It was a lot more qualitative that we found, but it definitely did guide some of those decisions. And we tried doing basically entry surveys if we knew they came from another competitor. Those, we didn't want to distract the onboarding experience, and so we kind of turned those off pretty immediately. But if you want the data, it's pretty easy to figure it out, if that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Vincent from Thrive.
Yeah.
We've been thinking about this value metric a lot internally, and the problem we have with it is that customers won't understand most likely the value that we give them, right? Because it'd either be something that we calculated, and that they're like, for example, hours saved, which is the result of all the things we did for them. But customers don't. It doesn't mean anything to them, right?
Yeah.
So it's been hard for us to pick something, and other companies have mentioned when they tried it, they got pushback on like that people didn't understand what that value means, so they didn't want to pay for it. Like any ideas on how to go about that? So
there's two axes to talk about here. The first is like how to pick your value metric. So there's always a perfect value metric. Normally the perfect value metric is hard to measure and hard to get agreement on from your customer, right? So like to talk about retain for a second, it's on dollars, right? And it's only on the dollars we bring you. So that is the perfect value metric for that product, at least in our testing and opinion. And then based on the research, it's easy enough to understand, and it's easy enough to get our customers to agree that that is right, and especially when looking at a calculation. Now, let's talk about HubSpot or a marketing product. The perfect value metric is money that you're getting from that platform that they've added to, right? But it's really hard to measure. Was that HubSpot? Was it my clever blog post title? Like, what was it that really brought those customers in? So in that particular respect, have that value metric and then take one step back and find a proxy. So for HubSpot, it's contacts, right? Which not everyone likes, don't get me wrong, but like with particular contacts, it's like, okay, if you have more contacts, you should be making more money. And that's a good value metric that we can align against. And then for them, they can easily explain it because it's a phone conversation. You can't buy HubSpot touchlessly, or you can't buy the core product touchlessly, I should say. And so that's kind of how I would think through the mental model of a value metric. And then you can actually test using max diff, like we talked about, that most important, least important. You can say, hey, when you think about our product's pricing, what's most preferred, what's least preferred? And you can show them the different options. And normally that breaks it down to about 2. Now the other axis is like understanding. Typically a value metric, the 3 traits are, it's easy enough to understand given your sales cycle. So if it's touchless, it's got to be a lot simpler than if you have a salesperson. In addition to that, it typically needs to align with where that customer gets value, and it needs to grow with the customer's usage in some capacity. So a lot of folks, they're like, oh, this is the great value metric. Like we talked about the size of the company. Unfortunately, the size of the company does not grow with the actual usage of the product. So it's problematic and it doesn't make sense. So that's a couple of mental models to kind of think through. Yeah, awesome. Should we do another slow clap? No?
All right, one more.
I got the mic.
Me? Hi there, excuse me. Hi, Patrick. John Markov from Coverage Book. Hey. Yeah. Would you recommend having a pricing table that just focuses on that single value metric and not have differentiated plans at all by feature?
Yeah.
Or
so it depends on your buyer. Everything depends on your buyer. That's like an answer to most of these questions. But to give you some context on that, if you have a technical buyer, complexity can go up. If you have a non-technical buyer, complexity typically has to go down. And so normally, if you have like a consumerized product that you're selling to moms or dads of kids of 2, or kids of a number of kids is 2, normally the value metric has to be a lot simpler than if you're selling to a DevOps engineer who's picking a security piece of software, right? And so what I typically recommend doing is you should optimize for as little differentiation as you can if you have the right value metric. So to give you an example, have you heard of Wistia, video hosting analytics? So Wistia, they basically give away most, if not all, of the features in every single plan, and then it's based on the number of videos that you essentially have in the account. The reason this makes it simple is because any upgrade conversation that you have is really straightforward. Hey, you have more videos, we're going to start charging you more. Oh, no, I'm going to delete some. Okay, cool. Or, oh, great, yeah, I love the product, I'm going to pay more, right? Now, as you get into a little bit more complex products and a more technical buyer, then you can start adding differentiation, but you have to be really, really good at figuring out what features make sense to differentiate. And there's 2 types of features in that case. There's pull features and then there's push features. So a pull feature is basically something like, you know that every time someone upgrades to plan C or that 3rd plan, they're going to need a Salesforce integration. Or if they upgrade to that plan, they're probably someone who knows they want a Salesforce integration. A push feature is kind of like, I don't really need this, but I'm paying for it now. Perfect examples like Salesforce. Salesforce is the quintessential value metric and feature differentiated. Anyone here buy Salesforce before? Yeah, it's not fun. Because you go in there and you're like 5 salespeople. Like this is when we were first buying Salesforce. And they're like, yeah, use our low-end plan, which is like $25 per user per month. And we're like, yeah, we're a small sales team, and that's what it says on the website. Yeah, and you get your HubSpot integration. We're going to give that to you. Oh, sorry, you get the integration. You don't get the API calls. To get the API calls, you have to be on the $125 per user per plan, right? So that's very push, right? And then you have to get upgraded to a plan where you're using 20% of the features, right? So long story short, I would think about the complexity of your buyer and your complexity of the actual user. optimize for a value metric and try to eliminate as many of those features as possible, and then only use those feature differentiations as like slight backstops where you don't want someone who should be on plan C using plan A, and that's kind of the mental model I'd think through that on.
Well, question over here.
Hi, Patrick. My name is Henrik from SideChat, and we are going to launch our product soon. We have some early access subscribers and want to send them a survey.
Cool.
And you already talked about the Van Westendorp method to find out the possible pricing range.
Yep.
And the problem we have is we building an OS for web design agencies, and there isn't any other problem software out there, so they don't know what they will get when we actually launch. So it's quite hard to ask people. How much would you like to pay if they don't know what they get? So how would you figure out the pricing we should?
What's really funny is this started working now, guys. I'm going to answer your question, but I wanted to get some... Oh, now it's not working. It was working. I want to go back to a slide. Can you rock me back there? Awesome. I don't know if it's you or me driving right now. It's kind of fun. All right. So to answer your question, people don't know what they're getting, right? Keep going. Keep going, yeah. Keep going. Keep going. Sorry. Go back. Sorry. A couple more. This is entertaining, I hope. Yeah, right here. OK, cool. So when you're asking someone about something that they don't know or they don't understand, what you'll notice is that this curve, this elasticity curve, if you go one slide forward, it's going to be very flat in the bottom. So right now, if I go ask people about AI, no one really knows what AI is. Like, they know what AI is, but like they don't understand it from a marketing perspective, right? And we've seen so many products that go, oh, and it's got AI and machine learning. And your customer, especially if they're non-technical, is like, oh, that's cool. And they don't really know what that means. And so when we ask people about, like, and we've done this, we asked about a sales product as a control and then a sales product with AI. And what we found is that that AI boosted willingness to pay about 20%. But the basically curve on the bottom was flat because people don't have a concept of it, right? So basically, all of your ranges are going to be much wider. And that's OK, right? Because it's early. And so you can essentially look at, OK, based on this, I'm going to cross-reference this with some other data, and I'm going to put my price there, right? Now, if you're later stage and as you kind of go forward, all of a sudden, you'll have the ability to collect data from your customers who already are using the product and then prospects who haven't used your product. And then you can cross-reference that data to start to figure out, hey, should I raise my price? Should I lower my price? Should I keep it the same? In contrast, just to give you the last bit of context, if we asked about transactional email, like SendGrid or Postmark or things like that, this curve would be a really, really deep V, and the range would be probably a few cents because it's so commoditized of a market. But this is to your advantage, right? Because there are some value propositions you can use, and we've seen this as well, that no product changes, just changing your value proposition will increase willingness to pay and flatten out that curve a bit. So long story short, I wouldn't be afraid of that. I would just think about it as, hey, they're going to get a landing page's worth of information and then answer this question or this set of questions, and that's going to basically influence where you should peg your prices first. It's a good question. It's great. Cool. Anything else?
All right, one more last question now, I think.
Yeah.
Hi, Patrick. I wanted to ask you about the price elasticity. So how do you, what do you ask to calculate that in your survey?
Two slides back, please.
And then how do you actually
calculate it? These are the questions that you ask.
Yeah.
Same questions. And if you go to the next slide, basically what you'll notice, and I'll do this on the other end too, is that, I don't know if this is going to squeak, sorry. So the bottom end of this curve, the simplest way to do this is you take the bottom end of this curve, and you'll notice it's basically the same. Now, that's not the economist statistician's textbook way to do it, but that's the easiest proxy you can get. The way that we do it, it's a little bit more complicated. We built a model that basically takes into account this data and then does some what's called function filling analysis and a couple of other things. But it's one of those things where most of the time, you don't need to make it that complicated unless you're looking for extra sensitivity. So to give you context, asking these questions, you'll get probably within, for each segment, plus or minus 20% of reality. We've gotten it down to about plus or minus 3%. But it's one of those things where most of the time you don't need that sensitivity. Like our customers who are typically bigger, they need that sensitivity because they're making $10, $100 million decisions sometimes. But long story short, that's the bottom end of the curve. I'll just show you guys here. So basically this part right here, that's a proxy for down here essentially. So if you're already collecting that data, you basically get 2 for 1, which is super helpful.